This build surprised me. I did not expect to be able to infinitely place healing rifts that both damage enemies and replenish my grenades, but this build does exactly that and so much more. And the craziest part of this build we will get to in just a moment. But first, we need to break down exactly what this build is and why we're using it. This build is the Arc Warlock Perfected. Bungie recently adjusted the Vesper of Radius, and this thing is way more powerful and way more fun to use than ever before. And it's arguably one of the best exotic reworks that Bungie has ever done. So let's break down everything we need to know and use in this build. First things first, we're going with the Storm Trance Super because we're not using Geomags for Chaos Reach. And with the mods that we have on, we're going to be able to get our supers back extremely fast. And so we're going to want to use our supers as consistently as possible. So Storm Trance is the choice of super that I'm going for. However, if you like Chaos Reach, it's really not that bad of an option for this. So pick whichever one you want. Now, moving on to the abilities, we are definitely going to use Healing Rift. And we're going to have the awesome ability of being able to span them almost infinitely. As long as you have the proper subclass setup and proper mods on your armor, you can literally get your rifts back faster than you can use them most times. And so we're definitely selecting Healing Rift for the maximum survivability compared to the Empowering Rift, and because we are purposely trying to pop these rifts near enemies, because the entire build is centered around being surrounded by enemies. So the ads are going to be constantly getting up close to you and doing a lot of damage, and you're going to need that Healing Rift to survive. For the jump, we're going with Burst Glide, and for the melee, we're going to use Ball Lightning so that you can have a ranged melee attack that you can shoot at enemies from a distance, and this thing will do work for you while you prioritize other targets. And for the grenade, we will of course be going with Pulse Grenade, the most powerful grenade in PvE for any arc class right now. Storm Grenade used to be the best choice, but it did get a harsh nerf, so almost all arc builds are using Pulse Nades these days. Now it's time to jump onto the juicy stuff, the aspects and the fragments. And it's very important to pick the right ones and to understand the exact gameplay loop that we're looking for. For the first aspect, we're going with Arc Souls, and the reason why is pretty obvious. When you have infinite rifts to put down, you get infinite Arc Souls, and these little arc buddies are very strong and can clear an entire room of ads for you. They automatically aim and shoot all enemies nearby, and keep in mind with this aspect, your rift will charge faster when your allies are nearby, so make sure your teammates jump in that healing rift with you. They'll get the offensive utility of Arc Souls added with the survivability of the healing rift, and the added benefit of giving you your rift back much faster. Teamwork makes the dream work here, and that will be one of the many different gameplay loops that we're actually utilizing with this build here, so don't forget that. It's also important to keep in mind that while amplified, your Arc Souls will become supercharged and gain an increase to fire rate. And thankfully with this build, we're going to have a near infinite uptime to amplified, meaning your Arc Souls are almost always going to be supercharged. One such source to get you amplified is that rapidly defeating targets with arc damage makes you amplified, which is why also using arc weapons will synergize perfectly with this build, although albeit not necessary. Risk Runner, a machine gun, an arc fusion rifle, or in my instance an arc glaive, which I was utilizing for extra survivability, are all excellent options in the energy slot and will really help aid in the synergy with this build. The next aspect that we're using is Electrostatic Mind. Defeating targets with arc abilities or defeating jolted or blinded targets creates an ionic trace. Those ionic traces are those little lines of lightning chasing you down on the ground, and they too will make you amplified, perfectly synergizing with this build, allowing you to supercharge your Arc Souls even more. And keep in mind that the exotic that we're using is the Vesper of Radius, which also has blinding utilities on it. So basically this build is just absolutely crazy for constant ionic traces, constant orb creation, constant blinding of enemies, infinite rift spam, infinite grenade spam, infinite melee spam, and extremely fast supers. When placing your rift down with a Vesper of Radius, it will give out arc shockwaves that both damage and blind enemies. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. But first we need to go through all of the fragments that you're going to want to use. The first and most important being Spark of Resistance. It doesn't matter what arc build we're using. When going into PvE, you're going to want Spark of Resistance because staying alive means everything, and an increase to damage resistance while surrounded is extremely important. And this also synergizes perfectly with Vesper of Radius because you're purposefully trying to be surrounded by combatants. So this is a must for most arc builds, but especially this one. The next is Spark of Shock, which allows your arc grenade to jolt targets, which will make your grenade significantly more powerful and will tie perfectly with Electrostatic Mind to create more ionic traces, and is definitely a must-have fragment for this build. Now the next two fragments aren't nearly as essential, but they are very strong, and I will give you a couple of variants if you want to try something different. The first one is Spark of Beacons, which is while you are amplified, your arc special weapon final blows create a blinding explosion. So like I mentioned before, if you're using an arc weapon in the energy slot, this will synergize perfectly with this by creating that blinding explosion, tying in perfectly to creating more ionic traces, giving you more supercharged Arc Souls. But not everyone is going to be using an arc energy weapon, so an alternative I'll give to this is Spark of Magnitude, which is your lingering arc grenades have extended duration. This will enhance the duration of your pulse grenades, allowing you to have more damage output to higher tiered targets like mages, champions, or bosses. So if you're not rocking an arc energy weapon, definitely swap to Spark of Magnitude. And our last fragment here is Spark of Amplitude. Rapidly defeating targets while you are amplified creates an orb of power. This synergizes well with this build, but is not a must-have fragment. You could swap this out for something else if you wanted to utilize a slightly different playstyle with this loadout, but overall I think that is the best fragment for most players, and that's going to complete the subclass part of this build video. Now we're going to go through and break down all of the armor mods that we have from head to toe. Starting with the helmet, we're rocking double dynamo, and the reason why is that this is going to significantly reduce our super cooldown when using our class ability near targets, and as mentioned previously, you want to use your rift when standing right near enemies. That's the most optimal usage of the Vesper of Radius, and so dynamo will play perfectly into this build and allow us to get our supers back extremely fast. So we're rocking 2 of those and then a harmonic siphon. Because I have an energy arc weapon and a heavy arc weapon, I'll be making tons of orbs of power with harmonic siphon. For the gauntlet, we're going with fastball always. If you want your grenades to land consistently on the exact target, always have fastball on. Then we have bolstering detonation, which grants class ability energy when you cause damage with your grenade, and we're obviously going to be causing a ton of damage with our grenade. Because pulse grenade is so strong, this will feed us our class ability back very consistently and will make it very advantageous for you to throw your pulse grenade into a pile of adds or onto a high tier target like a major, champion, or a boss. Every single time that pulse grenade ticks, you're going to get a boost to your class ability energy. And lastly, we're going to have on firepower. Your grenade final blows create orbs of power. Those pulse grenades are going to clear adds, majors regularly, and in doing so, you'll make even more orbs on top of the arc siphon on the helmet. Now for the chest piece, obviously every different activity can have different affinity threats like solar threat, arc threat, void threat, and you'll usually want to have your resistance on your chest match that threat because you don't want to get one shot by any enemies. But on this build especially, you will want to make sure to have melee damage resistance on because you're going to be so close to enemies popping your rifts that occasionally one is going to get close to you and hit you with a melee. And if you're in challenging endgame content, it's going to hurt pretty bad. So melee damage resistance is a must for this build. And as far as the other 2 mods go, just put on whichever 2 synergize the best with the activity you're doing. If a ton of enemies are shooting void at you, void resistance, solar resistance, etc. Now moving on to the boots. The first mod I have on is Arc Scavenger. So that way my arc weapons get a bonus reserves. And obviously I said I'm using an arc energy weapon and an arc power weapon. It just allows me to get a little bit more ammo. Not an essential mod, but definitely a nice one. The next one is essential though. Recuperation is going to be essential for trying to stay alive. In challenging content, it will be so important so that they function as life packs that you jump onto if you're getting extremely weak. Recuperation is a mod I use for almost all of my builds in PvE, except void builds that have Devour by picking up an orb. Aside from void builds, I pretty much have this on every build I use, regardless of the subclass. The next mod we're using is Orbs of Restoration. Picking up an Orb of Power grants a small amount of energy to your ability with the least energy. This is a nice mod that will help replenish the ability energy where you need it most, so I highly recommend to put that on your boots. Now it's time for the mods on the class item. The first one we're going to be utilizing is Powerful Attraction. This will pick up all of the orbs nearby when you pop your rift, and obviously when you are popping rifts so consistently, this is going to be really nice. You won't have to run around and go pick up orbs nearly as much. Powerful Attraction synergizes extremely well with this build particularly because we get to spam class abilities so often. The next mod we're using is Distribution. This reduces all ability cooldowns when using your class ability near targets. Now normally I use Bomber for a large majority of builds, but Distribution works perfectly here because we're trying to use our class ability right next to the enemies to optimize Vesper of Radius's perk. This is the mod of choice for the class item. And lastly, we're using Utility Kickstart. This will help give you a near infinite loop of class abilities. Lastly, as far as armor goes, we need to talk about the Vesper of Radius and exactly what this exotic does. Planetary Turret reads, rifts periodically release arc shockwaves. Final blows with these shockwaves create an arc explosion. So you'll place your rift down and the shockwaves will go out periodically. They will kill enemies nearby and create explosions. And since we have an arc subclass on, the shockwaves and subsequent explosions blind nearby targets, which then by killing those blinded targets, you create an ionic trace. Lastly, it reads rift energy recharges faster when you are surrounded by targets, which is essential. You need to be near targets when popping your rift. The class ability energy regained when surrounded by targets is so exponentially high and makes this such a strong exotic, and that is how to use Vesper of Radius properly. As far as stats go, I went with 100 resilience, 100 discipline, and then as much recovery as I could get. Intellect and strength are not needed, and neither is mobility. For the artifact mods, the ones that you'll want to to make sure to unlock are as follows. Authorized mods arc, authorized mods melee. Amped up is going to be huge for this because you're going to stay amplified longer, which is going to create more ionic traces. Thunderous retort is going to make our super even stronger when cast while critically wounded. And because we're going to have near infinite uptime of amplified, you're almost always going to benefit from thunderous retort. Your arc super is going to absolutely blast away all of the enemies nearby. Next up is electric armor, which is going to give us more damage resistance while amplified, which is just the eye skill on the cape for survivability on this build. Next up, you definitely want lightning strikes twice, because this is just going to allow you to be able to spam those pulse grenades and keep this infinite loop going. And lastly, you're going to want shock and awe, arc final blows while you're amplified, summon burst of lightning that damages and jolts targets. This artifact perk is actually really strong when it works, right? A lot of times the burst of lightning can come down and not actually kill any enemies nearby, but if there are enemies nearby, this is extremely strong and significantly increases the lethality of this build. Now that is absolutely everything for the Vesper of Radius build. This is Arc Warlock Perfected. If you want the dim link to this, it will be down below. You can click on it and it should equip everything for you. If you found this video helpful, make sure to subscribe to the channel with notifications on and click on the screen right here to watch another video from this channel. As always, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Later.